Good afternoon, everybody. Bienvenue tout le monde. Nous sommes vraiment, on se réjouit cet après-midi de vous accueillir ici à l'Université d'Ottawa et au Centre de recherche et d'enseignement sur les droits de la personne. C'est le premier événement de la session académique 2024-25. Donc, ça nous fait énormément plaisir d'avoir ce partenariat avec le groupe de 78 pour un événement qui a affaire au droit international humanitaire, qui est un sujet qui nous tient vraiment à cœur et pour lequel nous travaillons avec nos partenaires de la Croix-Rouge tous les ans pour produire une école d'été. Et vous trouverez, je pense, quelques informations autour de la table ou à l'entrée qui vous donneront plus de renseignements sur l'école d'été. So, as I was saying, my name is Viviana Fernandez. I am Associate Director at the Human Rights Research and Education Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first event of our academic session 2024-2025. The topic of our first event, public event, has to do with international humanitarian law, and it is a topic that is really dear to our hearts because, as some of you may know, we have an annual summer school that is conducted with our partners at the Canadian Red Cross, and we have Fanny Dagenet, who is representing our partners this afternoon. And so with further ado, I'll just pass the word to the chair of the Group of 78, Mr. Roy Culpepper. And I'm sure I mispronounced.
Yes, on behalf of the Group of 78, I'd like to add my welcome to this discussion on the relevance of the Geneva Conventions, which recently had their 75th anniversary. It's a good time for reflection on what has worked and what has not worked over the past 7 or 8 decades. Are the Geneva Conventions still fit for purpose? What actions can states take to ensure their effective implementation or accountability for serious violation? We hope to find some answers to these questions in our discussion shortly. In beginning this event, we would like to pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. And we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Before I turn things over to our moderator, Ruby Daher, to introduce our distinguished speakers and start the discussion, I'd like to express special thanks to John Packer, who suggested to me in April that we organize such a discussion and that Human Rights Research and Education Center would be pleased to host the event. I would like to thank the Canadian Red Cross for co-sponsoring the event as well. While I have the floor, I'd like to put a plug in for the Group of 78's upcoming annual policy conference taking place on September the 27th and 28th on the topic, Citizens Confront the Climate Crisis. It features Sephora Berman and Catherine Aubert, among other excellent speakers. Information and registration is available on the G78 website. Now, Ruby, my colleague. Ruby Daher is chair of the Group of 78 Peace and Security Working Group. Besides being a member of the board and executive committee of the G78, Ruby is an assistant professor on the faculty of the School of International Development and Global Studies. Her research and interests encompass the Middle East, development economics, war and peace studies, and legitimacy in post-conflict states, among other topics. Ruby, thanks so much for moderating this panel, and over to you.
Thank you, Roy. Okay. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. Just one note, this event is held in English. However, if you would like to ask a question in French, I think quite a number of us are bilingual, so we can translate and then also try to provide an answer. I was, as everybody here, watching the news over the last year or so, but even before that, as a person who researches war and as a person who's lived through civil war, was born in one and grew up in one, it is something that really interests me. But the part of it that interests me the most, I think, is the ability to stop seeing people as human beings and start concentrating on tactics of war and on strategies of war, and yet humanity gets lost in the mix. And then some people get to decide something somewhere really far away while we suffer. And so that kind of led me to international development and led me to focus. And so today, as we reflect on the signing of the Geneva Conventions back in 1949 and the amended protocols in 1977 and 2005, and this idea embedded in the Geneva Conventions about this equilibrium between the necessity of war, whether you agree with that or not, and the aspect of humanity, and that we can't stop seeing people as human beings who have lives. It is really interesting to see the struggle to keep us away from tipping into a cycle of inhumanity and disasters and atrocities. And this idea of the objective and the purpose of the Geneva Conventions of sort of minimizing the suffering of people, but not saying no to war, which I think is a very difficult balance, but also I think is very much a reflection of politics and international negotiations and the international system that we have. And so in today's talk, John will be speaking to the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, but also talking about some of the tensions and issues and whether it's still fit for its purpose, challenges of how to implement it in the future, and perhaps not only of the conventions, but also the international humanitarian law as well, the IHL. And Fanny will also reflect on these on these issues, but also the discussion and John's contribution. So let me sort of set the scene a bit. So building on what Roy said, we have more than 120 active conflicts or wars, depending on how you want to call them, around the world right now, which is apparently a six-fold increase from 1999. So this is a significant rise in the amount of conflicts that we have around the world. And at the same time, we have a significant amount of dehumanization happening, whether it's dehumanization within one's own borders, whether, through politics or economics, or internationally through the idea of national security, through the idea of representing certain groups as terrorism, other groups as hateful people, whatever it is. There's a significant amount of dehumanization. We also have, which is to me very interesting, because at this time, which is a reflection of also sort of post-colonialism or during, at the end of the colonial period, where we actually see countries that deem themselves to be the most moral, countries that deem themselves to be the example of democracies and democratic development be criticized for how inhumane they are in their actions towards certain groups of people. And I think that is really interesting, and thinking about these loopholes and how these loopholes are being exploited, and why is it okay for some and not for others, and why is it that we tend to be faster in actions on one side but not necessarily on the other. And so you can think about Guantanamo Bay and the detainees, you can think about the drone strikes in Yemen, you can think about what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine, you can think about what's happening in Palestine, both West Bank and Gaza and in Israel. You can think about the Sudan, what's happening in Sudan. And you can start to see the differences among many others, the Rohingyas. You start to see the differences in the discourses and explanations. And so some have criticized the fact that there's been some perversion of the international humanitarian law, some perversion of the Geneva Conventions, the abuse of them, lack of enforcement, the perception that it is imposed on some but not others, and who are these some and why not the others? Why is it so selective? And again, this halo effect that we see around some democratic countries who deem themselves to be the most moral, the ones that would be saving the world, and why is it that we cannot touch them with this criticism as much? And so our discussion today will kind of delve a lot into that, but also help us think about collectivity and collective action. And I'm hoping as well it allows us to think about the future as well. There's more talk now about the outer space as being another domain of war, and what does that really imply other than drones and AI and so forth. So thinking about if the Geneva Conventions and anything adjustments that come thereafter with the protocols or even the new discussions can deal with this new type of war. But I'm going to leave this because I know John and I know where John is going with this. So I'm just going to leave it with these two comments that I found really interesting when I was watching Lakmini, I'm sorry, I'm probably massacring her name, Senaviratian of the ICRC in an event in the US in the American Society of International Law in April. And she said two things that I really blew my mind. And one is to say, she said, this is not about questioning the fundamentals. I'm not quoting directly, I'm paraphrasing. It's not about questioning the fundamentals, those we do not touch, but to go back to the objectives and the purposes. And not to encourage narratives that they consider, people who believe in the Geneva Conventions, as well as Lakmini, consider harmful about IHL being fit for purpose. So do not question IHL and its purpose and the fundamentals of the Geneva Conventions and IHL. But how can we move forward with that? So I find that to be interesting, and I'll put that to John maybe in the description of looking at how to move forward. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with John's comments, and then we're going to have Fanny respond to John's comments, and then we'll open up the discussion to the floor, and then closing remarks, and then thanking everybody for being here. Just a quick bios. You have the bios online, so just really quickly. John is a Nuremberg Jessin Professor of International Conflict Resolution in the Faculty of Law and Director of Human Rights Research Education Center at the University of Ottawa. His bio is amazing. I would suggest that you take a look at it. But just to sort of summarize again, looking at human rights issues, Afghanistan, Burma, Myanmar, Iraq, advise on several conflicts, genocide or risks of genocide, issues related to international development instruments, prevent, resolve, or repair harms, and working with or contributing to major reports on genocide against the Rohingyas, the Uyghurs, the Ukrainians, and Tigrayans as well. And since 2014, he has served as the director of the University of Ottawa's annual summer school on international humanitarian law. And Fanny Dagenet-Dion is a lawyer registered with the Quebec Bar, works in the International Humanitarian Law Unit at the Canadian Red Cross, and contributes to the dissemination of the international humanitarian law. She's also pursuing a master's degree in international law at UQAM. And before joining the Red Cross, Fanny also worked in Guatemala with local human rights organizations representing victims of armed conflict. So those are really shortened versions of their bios. I would highly suggest that you look on the website, and you'll have a more fuller version of the amazing panel that we have here with us. So on to you, John.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Also, thank you for Roy for reaching out initially, and for this opportunity to collaborate again, as we've had that great occasion in the past to do. And thanks to everyone for participating. I'll just say a further word about my own background. So since about 1987, when I first started to work with the UN High Commission for Refugees, so that's 37 years ago, I've principally been involved in and continue to be engaged in situations of violence, may or may not be characterized as armed conflict. It's a whole thing we can discuss. But where the intersection between widespread, systematic, sometimes called gross and systematic human rights violations coincided with conflicts, which may or may not be armed conflicts. And so this is sometimes said by observers in a kind of simplified terms that human rights apply in peace, and In war, human rights, war is the absence of human rights. And then the question is, well, what applies in context of war? I'm using these terms now not technically, just broadly. And so the argument was, well, war is not the absence of law or the absence of anything applying, because some people think that. In fact, just yesterday on CNN, the former American ambassador Jeffries was asked about a certain situation in the world where there was kind of clearly a non-compliant position of an important state, and he was asked about what he made of this, and he just replied, said, "Well, it's a war," and that's apparently supposed to end the story. We're also shot at, well, it's a war, and apparently all is fair in love and war. So the very short answer is, even in war, there are rules. You might think, hey, rape is unlawful. But I might surprise you to know there are actually rules that apply to forms of aggravation and so forth. Yeah, of course rape is unlawful. By the way, war is unlawful. If you don't know that, that's in the Charter of the United Nations, the use of force, except for two purposes. One, strictly in self-defense, which is not to initiate war. And the second is the use of force for collective security purposes, which largely implies UN Security Council sanction, but not necessarily, but at least for collective security purposes. So in principle, as we sit here today, there should not be war and there should not be rape, but we have both, as a matter of fact. But it doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. And so that kind of essential contradiction is something that we have to struggle with. Is that sensible? Is it a good idea to have kind of rules of things that are supposed to be prohibited? And I'm going to argue that it is a good idea, even though it's in obvious tension. And perhaps this tension is now becoming stretched to the point of maybe not just a lesser evil, but maybe something that we have to really tackle and say we need to surpass. I'm going to read a couple other short little points. I mentioned Ambassador Jeffries because that's yesterday's news, right? But it's actually of a contemporary situation. And Ruby just mentioned how we have more violent conflicts, mainly, almost overwhelmingly, intrastate conflicts. In fact, the contemporary phenomenon is that there are very, very rare interstate wars for which the laws of war or armed conflict were elaborated. And the very notion, some of the terminology we use, like high contracting parties, essentially means states. So it's a state-centric regime. But that's not actually coinciding with the kinds of armed conflicts we have today. We are overwhelmingly non-interstate conflicts. In fact, that's one of the shocking things about the Russia-Ukraine war, which of course is a special military operation if you're in Russia. I think legally you have to call it that. But it's a war, right? But that's clearly interstate. But might surprise you to know that the actual tendency of deaths and injuries in percentile terms and the trajectory of it has been a very steady diminution for at least a century. And if you read works by, for example, Steven Pinker and others, you will be surprised to learn that we are living in more secure, in the sense of less deaths and injuries in violent armed conflicts than in historical terms, particularly again as percentage of population. You might be even surprised to know in historical terms, for example, the 80s year war that really led to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, over those 80 years, the total number of deaths was between about 600 and 700,000. That's all, over 80 years in all of Europe. Whereas, for example, World War II was about 80 million. World War I was about a third of that. The major actual losses of life in the world over recorded history, and now these are the work of polemologists, people who study war, were actually, for example, massive Chinese civil wars. which had tens of millions over different centuries of deaths. So here we have another interesting thing. What do we mean? Because a lot of the laws of war and the laws of armed conflict, is more correctly to say today, are focused on protection, the idea of protection. And we'll talk about who and so forth, and this idea of civility and humanity, mentioning humanity. And in this regard, we might ask whether it's the armed conflict in the sense of notions of combatants, battlefield, and the kind of words we associate with war are actually any longer the correct terms, the germane paradigm that we should use. For example, millions and millions of people in various situations, if we talk about Sudan today, may or may not be subjected immediately to the sharp end of the spear in terms of armed groups literally killing them, but they will be subjected to starvation, to disease, to the violence, the structures of violence that attend armed conflicts. And so we could probably more correctly talk about insecurity, violence, and protection. And in fact, this is increasingly what is discussed in terms of the protection of civilians and protection more broadly. Okay, so we have actually, now I'll put kind of a jurist's hat on. If we look in historical terms, we see that there have been a few tendencies of normative developments over centuries. The actual laws of armed conflict and the laws of war, so here we can divide them. Sometimes we use Latin terms, jus in bello, the rules, the law that applies in conflict, and jus ad bellum, the laws which apply to war. And remember, I've said since 1945 at least, war is unlawful, so there aren't supposed to be laws about that. But historically there were, right, for millennia in time immemorial. And it might surprise you to know that since time immemorial, there have been limits on both the resort to war and the terms of the conduct of war. Certain means and methods in particular were outlawed, things like a crossbow. And they were outlawed because they either gave unfair advantage, it was considered, and so there was this notion of fairness in war, or they rendered certain effects that were unchivalrous, for example, maiming persons, or we could say somehow disquieting, and those who had power decided that they should not be tolerated. Maybe because of the costs also of them. So the trajectory of these norms and standards was to ever greater specificity. And yet at the same time, scientifically, our creativity has been unbounded. We, as a species, are remarkably bloody and amazingly capable of inventing new means and methods of injuring, harming, killing, destroying, and now utterly annihilating our, not even persons, but our species. And so we've been trying to continually constrain this. That's one way you can understand the kind of trajectory of the development of the laws of armed conflict. And at a certain point, this idea of humanity, which I'll come back to in a moment, came into this as a principal basis of constraint. And that's relatively recent, last 200 years, less than 200 years about. At the same time, a whole other thing has happened, particularly in the last century, which is two other trajectories simultaneously. One is an idea of completely different paradigm, reconceptualizing relations of human beings. And this idea of human rights has come in. Human rights did not exist, and in fact barely existed when the four Genevas of 12 August 1949 that we're celebrating 75th anniversary today were adopted. In fact, less than basically 9 months after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights rooted in the UN Charter had been adopted. Prior to that, human rights was not really a basis of constraint. But human rights and human rights law as a category, which is ever expanding, has presented a completely different paradigm about relations. And if we talk about insecurity, violence, protection, and so forth, we can see that this kind of strand or tendency has been gaining greater space, particularly in terms of the illegality of the resort to force. But a third element I'll mention, which is quite significant, is to move away from the state as a principal actor and to actually look at individuals not as beneficiaries, as either protected persons, because international humanitarian law of armed conflict, basically imposes duties on powers not to do things. It does not actually confer rights on individuals or persons as beneficiaries. Human rights law takes the opposite approach. It roots rights within the natural human being, humans. That's your sole qualification to have human rights. And those are opposable to states and increasingly other actors who have duties or obligations of respect. But the third strain I want to talk about is broadly international criminal law. And this is idea that individual human beings also possess duties. And these are overwhelmingly prohibitions, what you should not do. Some of them have ancient origin, piracy, for example, slavery more recently, and so forth. But now an increasing catalog has been elaborated most kind of simplistically or simply in the Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court, which categorizes four categories of crimes: duties on natural persons. Now, these three strands are not separate and exist as some people sometimes claim, including, I'm sorry to say, even members of armed forces and even Judge Advocate General's offices. They say, oh, the laws of war apply during war, and human rights don't apply then, they apply in peace. And that's wrong. So human rights apply at all times unless there is a derogable basis, which are strictly limited and for certain few rights. So human rights apply all the time, as does international criminal law. And so these are overlapping tendencies which are supposed to constrain collectively the kind of violence or what we consider to be unacceptable from a humane perspective. Okay, so that's just a quick thing to say in terms of categorization. Now, I want to read for you an observation made by someone. You will understand who it was. I'll just read it. The moral sense of the importance of human life, the humane desire to lighten a little of the torments of all these poor wretches or restore their shattered courage, the furious and relentless activity which a man summons up at such moments, all these combine to create a kind of energy which gives one a positive craving to relieve as many as one can. There is no more grieving at the multiple scenes of this fearful and solemn tragedy. And so this was an observation by Henri Dunant at the Battle of Solferino in 1859. Which was a one-day battle, by the way, but what he considered to be simply morally repugnant. That was his response. There was no law on this, largely to what he was responding to. He wrote about it in a book called Un Souvenir de Solferino in 1862. And from that, he invested in creating a movement, which became, and creating an entity. He thought if there could be an entity that could just relieve at the moment of those who are injured, they're out of the battle, but why must the suffering exist? So he wasn't challenging war. He wasn't challenging armed conflict at all. He was just saying the extreme suffering was repugnant. And he, by the way, he championed very much some women in the town, I forget the name of the town, where he said it was amazing. These women came out, young women, and simply provided assistance to help, irrespective of the side of the forces. So this idea also of neutrality. It didn't matter what the cause was or what or where they came from. In fact, these women didn't know where these people came from, but that they would just assist them and relieve on a basis of an impetus of humanity. And on that basis, he started the International Red Cross movement for two bases. One, a Christian idea, the Red Cross, but also a moral sense, which he called humanity. I'm now going to read a remark from, well, I'll tell you who it is in a moment, but the argument was made by the legal advisor to have sometimes said the most powerful man in the world, that the new paradigm of armed conflict renders parts of the Geneva Conventions obsolete and quaint. That was Alberto Gonzalez, who was the White House counsel to President Bush after 9/11, the interventions specifically in Afghanistan. And his argument was the war on terror and the change of the character of conflict now necessitated a different approach. And these quaint restraints of humanity simply didn't apply. This was challenged, and we can challenge it, but just to say that was 2002. And so it's not strange for us to say 22 years later, with all the violence and the kind of new techniques and methodologies we'll talk about in a moment, that we might ask ourselves, well, did he have a point? And I'd like to say he did have a point, but he was also wrong. They're not obsolete, but he had a point. They don't fully apply, or they don't hit the mark, or they're not fit for purpose or tailored and so forth. Is it possible that this trajectory of ever more precise elaboration of the laws of armed conflict or the overlap with human rights can satisfy that problem? I have my doubts, and I'll come to that now. So what are the kind of challenges, without going into the specific notions of the core idea of humanity? Because, by the way, humanity is not one of the core principles of the law of international humanitarian law. There are other principles like distinction, proportionality, and so forth. Humanity is a broad natural law moral reference, and it is included in certain kind of fallback provisions, such as Article 3, common to the Geneva Conventions, and so forth. But there are more elaborated specific notions. The question is, do they fit the contemporary challenges? So I'd like to now just reference a few of what those challenges are. So what has changed that really we need to take account of? So probably the most important thing which has changed is the character of war or armed conflict itself. So the state, in the time in which international humanitarian law was elaborated, we had the notion of the battlefield. And it's not too long ago that polemologists, we don't even talk about polemologists anymore, but there used to be institutes of polemology. There's still an Institute of War Studies at King's College in London, but almost no one has these kind of antiquated things anymore. But they used to talk about the battlefield. And by the way, the definition of an armed conflict from polemologists' perspective until not too long ago was 1,000 battlefield deaths. Well, there are a lot of violent conflicts in the world that don't have 1,000 battlefield deaths. But I'd like to ask you, what's the battlefield? So in an era of changing technology, where is that battlefield? If I'm a technician controlling a drone out of a center in Oklahoma, but delivering on a target in Afghanistan, where's the battlefield? So this is paradigmatically a challenge to the very concept. Polemologists, by the way, updated the notion of armed conflict about 20 years ago. They now talk about 25 deaths, but they don't say battlefield. They remove the word. 25 deaths, that's pretty darn small. Single incidents in many conflicts are exceeding 25 deaths. So what exactly are we talking about here in terms of the notion of our armed conflict? So the character of conflict itself has changed. Whole societies at risk and so forth now challenge what we mean by this. Another crucial thing that has changed is the character of the actors. So all of international law and international humanitarian law of armed conflicts predicates itself on the state, the high counterparties of the state. If you look at things like the fragility index, I forget who produces it today, about 2/3 of the states in the world now are categorized in various degrees of fragility, even failed states and so forth. Is the state the principal actor? The answer is no. We already mentioned that most conflicts are now intrastate, involving groups. We're not even sure what some of these groups are. So if we ask some of these groups, sometimes characterized as terrorist, which is not a technical legal term, we're not quite sure what they are. Some of them are in their character nihilistic. They want the destruction of everything. We could say ISIS is kind of understandable, or Daesh, because it imagines a caliphate control of territory, an established government, and authority. But it's not quite clear what some of these other groups are actually pursuing. It's a resort to violence. It's certainly a matter of insecurity. It's certainly targeting even purposefully their acts of terror on civilians, so protected persons. But is this war? Is this armed conflict? What is this? And I would say not only the character has changed, but the principal actors have changed. And the idea that the state can be in control and responsive or effective is doubtful, especially if we now talk about the effectiveness of a regime of law to have effectiveness. If it's only post facto with no capacity of effective reparation, because, for example, a nihilistic or other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, whether nuclear or the poor man's bomb, chemical weapons, and so forth, then that kind of makes the whole sense also inappropriate or not effective. That raises a question about technology. So now we're more and more talking about things like cyber war. We're talking about one of the interesting things in 9/11 was the use of civilian objects, a civilian aircraft, with civilian persons aimed at civilian infrastructure. That was the instrument. What is that? And if that's not protected, then nothing is protected. So now attacks, for example, on water, clean water systems, electricity systems, our whole world functions on electricity. If this is now not outside permissible targets of war, of armed conflict, then nothing is impermissible. So I think I could go on to the kind of challenges for this, but I think it behooves us to ask now: are these this regime properly tailored to be effective or not? And I would say we're seeing the far end of the point of their diminution to the point of vanishing. They may not be effective. If we're talking about waiting for nuclear war, this is the whole thing about preemptive strikes, then we're not only obviously too late, but it's kind of meaningless. So I think here we have to start talking more seriously. This is not to say that the laws of armed conflict are not relevant. They're relevant for certain specific cases. They're definitely relevant in the Donbass and eastern Ukraine right now. They're relevant in a lot of places. But they do not respond to the wide and widening breadth of kinds of conflicts, kinds of insecurity, kinds of protection that we seek. My suggestion for you, now to end on a more constructive view, is, and what I see, is that there is becoming a global, partly through telecommunications, global awareness of this tension and the costs of it, and the increasing need to actually, and so we talk more and more about overlapping regimes of human rights law, humanitarian law, criminal law, and making those more effective, and specifically from a preventative perspective, so that the actual prohibition on use of force, aggressive use of force. So, for example, the inclusion under the Kampala Protocol of 2010 in the Rome Statute for the crime of aggression is absolutely vital. If you don't actually make that effective as a prohibition, then your efforts to constrain the resort to ever more powerful and nihilistic uses of force is potentially for naught. We only need one example of this today, because we're not talking about 1945 and Nagasaki, and we're talking about the capability in hands, for example, if the Russian Federation dissolves next week, the potential for radical Chechen actors to have intercontinental nuclear. This happened at the end of the Cold War. I was involved in Crimea. The CIA categorized the third likeliest chance of nuclear annihilation in the world was the instability in Crimea in 1990, 1991, after the Middle East and after Kashmir. And still to this day, I can tell you there's not a full accounting of things like some of the battlefield nuclear weapons and so forth. We don't know where the scientists went. Some of them went to North Korea. Some of them went to Pakistan. Luckily, the Nunn Commission in the U.S. hired a bunch of them in the U.S., but we really don't know. So the risk, this is what's called catastrophic risk. The risk may be small. It's getting larger. Putin has several times referenced nuclear weapons, but the catastrophic character of that risk is global annihilation. So the cost factor here is not the 80s-year war of 700,000 soldiers on battlefields treated terribly. It is human annihilation. So my sense is that the strand of human rights law, the strand of international criminal law, have to come together more forcefully to actually vindicate the idea of the prohibition of the use of force, aggressive use of force, to have effective constraints on it, and so that we render the risks of the kind of violence that is preponderant, but I'm now going to say somewhat tolerable in the sense of disquieting and so forth, but not the kind of character that we would otherwise face. I'll end there. There's much more to talk about, including to say that these trajectories are still ongoing. So there was a third, for example, additional protocol to the Geneva Convention 1949 about 15 years ago, which had to do with markings to give more power, but it also prohibited, importantly, certain additional weapons, which we could talk about, trying to catch up, always post facto, always in the rearview mirror, with the speed of the man's capacity to do harm to other humans. Thank you very much.
Can I go right away? Thanks. Thank you so much, John. Thank you to the Group of 78 and the Human Rights Research and Education Center for the invitation. Of course, I work for the Canadian Red Cross, so I am part of the Red Cross and Red Crescent International Movement. I'm really delighted to be here. I think it's important. Of course, it's the 75th anniversary. We're going to talk more and more about the Geneva Conventions. We are really glad to be able to have that voice and to discuss them. I think it's always important to discuss IHL, to discuss the core of it. So I'm going to respond a little bit. So my intervention will be limited. I have 3 main points, and that's going to be it. So first, I will frame the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement's position. So what I'm going to say is going to be grounded into that position, into that field of law, which is international humanitarian law. Second, I'm going to talk about the fact that how the Geneva Conventions translate to our work on the battlefield. We don't say that anymore, but on the ground, so in conflict zones. And then I will argue why we think that the Geneva Conventions are still relevant and are a really great tool of developing more and more IHL and other fields of law for it to remain relevant. So for the framing, John has talked about the neutrality principle already. So of course, I want to start by saying that the Red Cross movement is neutral. It's not only a saying, it's something that's really important because we are working on the ground. Neutrality is one of the main reasons why we are allowed to be there on the ground, helping out people wherever they're from and whatever party to the conflict they are from. So we talk about neutrality because we are maintaining dialogue with every party to the conflict. So that is really important for us. I'm also going to focus on the legal framework of international humanitarian law. So what is contained in the Geneva Conventions. We've talked about other fields of law. They are really important, but I'm going to focus on IHL because I hold that responsibility to my colleagues who are, at the time we speak, maybe driving ambulances, maybe attending to civilian population and wounded soldiers. So that principle of neutrality, I'm inhabiting it because we want to protect them, and we owe that responsibility to those colleagues. I'm talking about the Geneva Conventions, but there are also other people on the ground helping out from all the movements. So when I talk about the movement, I talk, of course, about Canadian Red Cross. We have people over there, but there are also the institutional leadership of the International Committee of the Red Cross. We have colleagues here today. We have the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and other sister national societies from conflict zones, but from all around the world helping out. So that whole movement is important. So what I'm going to say here today is grounded into the principle of humanity, which we've talked about it, but it's grounded also in our operational reality. So that's on the ground, that's current. So that's really important for me to say. I'm really happy that we are discussing the importance and relevance of the Geneva Conventions. I'm happy that we are talking about IHL, and more than ever before, we have heard about IHL. And one thing that's really interesting for me is the fact that it's always being discussed. So parties to conflict say they allege that they are respecting IHL. Whatever the arguments are, whatever the reasoning behind, whatever we are agreeing or not, IHL is in the conversation. People are using IHL as a lever to justify what's going on. So that means that it is still relevant and the interpretation can evolve. We know that international law is complicated. It can be interpreted in many ways, but it is part of the conversation. So that's why I think it's really important to discuss it ourselves too. We don't have all the same interpretations of some elements, but it's still there in the conversation. So that's it for it's a common ground. Our role when we talk about the framework, what we are doing within the Geneva Conventions. So we are following international humanitarian law specifically. So other fields will talk about conflict, and it's really important that those conversations keep happening. But for us, IHL, once we are in the conflict, what can we do? When can we not do? That's imperative. We talked about the distinction between the law to go to war and the law of war. So jus ad bellum, jus in bello. The Geneva Conventions, they focus on the jus in bello. So once we are in the conflict, what we do. That distinction is really essential for us because that is what we don't go into the other arguments. We go once there is the conflict. So we recognize that war is a reality. It might not be lawful according to the UN Charter, but our posture is that we decide that we want to have rules because they happen. So right now we are hearing a lot about conflict. We've talked about the fact that more than 120 conflicts happening right now. That is a lot. There are conflicts going on. So the goal with our work is not to end those conflicts. It's to, within them, prevent, relieve suffering and make the principle of humanity be the one that is of importance. So as the holders of the Geneva Conventions, we are working towards the mission of the Geneva Conventions, but it's also a reciprocity. The reason why we are allowed there to relieve human suffering is because of the conventions, and then we are there applying what the conventions tell us to do. So there is a lot of work being done. We are having, when I say we, I'm talking about the whole movement, but the International Committee of the Red Cross is having a lot of dialogue with different parties to conflict, including the non-state armed groups. So even in non-international armed conflict that are most of the conflict going on right now, there is work that is being done to make sure that all the parties to the conflict are respecting IHL. So we are allowed to work because of those conventions. Their language is pragmatic. So our vision of it is that war has evolved, conflict have evolved, but there are still intemporal issues and rules that can still apply. The Geneva, mostly big topics that were covered by the conventions were wounded soldiers, detained persons, the protection of the civilian population. That's still relevant. That still needs to be applied. Those are still categories of people that we need to protect. So the core of it, even if the way we fight have changed, it's still important. I talked about jus ad bellum versus jus in bello. So we focus on the conduct of hostilities, which means that sometimes it's uncomfortable. I'm being bilingual on that. Uncomfortable. War has consequences, whether IHL is respected or not. So that's the position that we are adopting that can really make us, not comfortable in that. So we don't look at the use of force law, and we assume and we know that they are covered by other fields. They are being discussed in the international relations field, international law too. But the Geneva Conventions stay away from that, and we respect really strongly that distinction because it allows us to provide the highest level of protection, but also receive it. We've talked about the current crisis, the violations of IHL that are happening right now. So more than ever, we are hearing about some violations. The humanitarian personnel is under a great amount of threats. Urban warfare is having many devastating consequences. So even we've talked about the amount of death, even if the deaths have been lowering, the consequences of the fact that now the battlefield is the city. It's happening in Khartoum is a big example. It's the capital of Sudan, and that's exactly where the conflict is going on. So we are experiencing different consequences than before. But still, what is at core of the Geneva Convention is relevant. And what we advance is that the Geneva Conventions, they are law. And for a law to work, it needs to be enforced. So we can do our part of the work, which is mostly being on the ground and provide assistance. But the states that have ratified the Geneva Conventions, they're one of the only international instruments, if not the only one, that has been universally ratified. So there is a commitment to respect them. That commitment needs to be renewed. So not only to respect IHL, but also to ensure respect. So by different parties to conflict, by other states, that commitment needs to be strong. And it would be a great moment right now to make sure that we are hearing this commitment. So another important thing about IHL and the Geneva Conventions is the need for dissemination. That's namely why I'm really happy to be here discussing the contents of IHL. It's part of the dissemination. The states have the obligation to disseminate it. We have the obligation to disseminate it too. So the more people knowing the more people we have that know the contents of the IHL rules, the Geneva Conventions, the more knowledge we have, the more talks we can hold like that, and the more critiques we can make ourselves of the Geneva Conventions, of IHL. And as a population, we can lead the way and lead to accountability by states. If we know what we want from our commitments in IHL, we can talk about our government, and we could talk to our government and tell them what we feel as a government that represent us, IHL, how IHL could be applied. So that's an important tool. That's why I'm really happy to discuss it right now. And a last element that I want to know that I think really highlights the relevance of the conventions is the diversity of forums they have created after their adoption. So IHL is being discussed, but there are several additional dialogues on IHL. Technology is a good example. We have the group of experts discussing how we can apply IHL. Of course, it's post facto, and it's a challenge, but the dialogues are there. The commitment is there. We talk about disarmament. There are treaty developments, different kinds of weapons. So it's always proactive, not only set in stone, set in time. The additional protocols is a big example. They come from a commitment from states of making the IHL rules evolve to fit the newer, the more contemporary conflicts. They have been adopted and ratified by many states. So it still shows a commitment and a desire to go forward with the interpretation. The ICRC, on a regular basis, reads the Geneva Convention and provides commentary. So there is a need and a desire to make sure that it remains relevant in time and contemporary. So I think that would be it for me. I'm really grateful for the invitation, and I have 3 desires with what we want to do with IHL. I really wish for the Geneva Convention to be known as possible, as well interpreted, and that we can have a play in that. Whatever the size of that action is, I think that's what drives me, that's what inspires me to keep working, is that individually and collectively we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Fanny. One of the things that I do also want us to maybe perhaps also think about is that very few conflicts are intra-state conflicts, in a sense where there's always somebody behind, either antagonizing, either supporting, or either arming. So one of the things that us who study conflict, have more and recognize more and more. It existed before, especially during colonialism and in the Cold War as well, but more and more we're recognizing that intra-state conflict cannot happen if we don't consider everything that's coming from outside the borders and who's supporting the outside. And therefore, the discussions around the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law and the laws of war about those who are arming them or those who are responsible for delivering some of these weapons as well. So this is, I think, another aspect that is interesting. So now I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Again, you can ask them in French. We'll translate. For the sake of the mic, because we only have one, you can ask your question. Now I'm going to do a quick job, hopefully a good one, summarizing your question in general, just so that for the recording they can hear it. And then if I'm way off, please let me know, and then we'll direct the questions. So I see 1, 2, 3. Maybe we'll start with Anush. So in summary, sorry, I have to do this with what mechanisms are in place to enforce neutrality or hold those to account who don't allow neutrality so that effectively the aspect of humanity can be maintained and the support can happen?
Thank you. It's a really great question, and it leads us to the other fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. We are a movement, so there is universality, but there is also unity, and that's the same that goes with international law. So the independence of every either national society or every component of the movement makes everyone wanting to be part of the whole movement. There will be dialogue. There will be internal dialogue, most of the time confidential. So we don't know where it's going to lead, but it is that what we say in international law when we talk about states, about the sovereignty of the states, it exists with the national societies, with the components of the movement, because it is a unity. So every national society of the Red Cross and Red Crescent has their own structure being part of the movement. So there can be dialogue, but at some point it's part of the limits of we are sometimes acting in a whole concerted way, but there is also that independence of every national society. So it can lead to many issues, but it makes the movement strong because everyone is representing the whole particularities of their countries, I'd say, in a national society. So,
yeah. But what if there's violation of the principle of neutrality?
The answer would probably be in the dialogues within the movement. So
thank you for a great comment. And so a quick thing just to indicate, which I should have indicated. So this idea of international humanitarian law is a relatively recent part, last 200 years, less than 200 years, of the law of armed conflict. And so sometimes we hear about Hague law and Geneva law. So international humanitarian law is associated with Geneva law. It relates to Henri Dunant and so forth, and this invocation of humanity. There was some invocation historically also in Hague law, but the distinction largely is that this humanity is about the treatment of persons, whereas Hague law is about rules and methods and means of warfare, and this has an ancient pedigree, including, obviously a strong moral basis for it, but it's not about humanity. And I would argue that this is one of the essential contradictions. I would say that the resort to force as a means of settlement of dispute, whether it's jousters or whether it's nuclear weapons, is by its character inhumane and inhuman. I would say it's contrary to our human interests and so on, but inhuman as such. So I don't actually think there is that's a reconcilable notion. I also want to say that neutrality is one of the myths. And I'll just reference Desmond Tutu, who said that, neutrality in the face of injustice is to side with the perpetrator or the oppressor. And I think he said that if you're a mouse and the elephant has his foot on your neck, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So and I think this is the point, because in contemporary international law, as much as we know that certain actors, and here the Red Cross or armed forces, will have this construction, I would say a pretension and an audacious one, that they only deal with this, they actually cannot escape the other applicable law. So you cannot be neutral in the face of genocide. It's not permissible in law. So, I mean, with due respect, if you were part of the Red Cross and you're in the face of a genocide and you say, I'm neutral, that's actually not permissible. So whatever your bosses say. So it's a contradiction we need to come to terms with here. Well, I'll come back to your question in a moment. So now you're asking a question about enforcement. So if we talk about law and legal systems, enforcement is only one part. Sanctions and methods, systems of enforcement is only one part of law. And by the way, it's a small part of law. So we're all sitting here right now, and there's a ton of applicable law in this room right now. I'm not allowed to get up and punch you in the face. I could, but I'm not permitted to. There's legal regime but why doesn't it happen? It's not because of enforcement. There's no policeman here. I might not care. Maybe I can run faster than a policeman, and I've got a really fast car. I don't know. The main reason law is working here in this room right now that I don't punch you is because there is a social arrangement of a character of the law which compels me not to do it. Partly it's self-interest. Partly that's reciprocity. I don't want you to punch me in the face. But for example, if you're driving on a highway and there's no police anywhere around late at night, does it mean there's no applicable law on the highway? Is it only based on getting caught, or is it only based on whether you'll be prosecuted? Of course that's nonsense. You're still going to stay on this right side of the road. You're probably going to, roughly follow the rest of the rules and so forth. So I think here the problem with the lack of enforcement is when it is at the sharp end, when it is spectacular, when it is fundamental in the character of the norm, and it is disregarded, and increasingly what we're facing, shamelessly so. So the problem right now is there are certain places in the world where various actors are saying they don't care about the law. They actually ridicule the law. Then that attacks something more profound, which is the confidence necessary of those subject to the law to actually maintain the law and give it a legal character. That is, say, a compelling normative instrumentality. If that's gone, then you don't have law. And I think this is part of the problem, is that I'll say the armed forces of the world are still the product of a global, and now I'll give you my view, a global capitalist arms industry, which is entirely lawful and is massive and is legitimized, and with all its instrumentality and institutions, that is tricking us into believing that somehow this is law. And I think it's now on the edge of not being law.
And maybe I could just add one little thing to that, is that when you look at war studies, you're seeing a significant spike in private militias and mercenaries, and a way of giving them the responsibility and washing your hands from it. And we often talk about Wagner and others, but there are also, I think the largest one is an American company. And, the top 7 are from Europe, North America, and then Russia. And so we tend to, they tend to offload responsibility. And that, I think, also leads to this idea of we just close our blind eye and we don't care about the law, and therefore it's difficult to enforce. And the other part, though, I have to say, as a person, again, who lived through war, neutrality in a sense of how everybody needs to be helped. I appreciate that and I get that. However, where I have an issue with it is when you only rely on neutrality and you don't do the rest of it, not as in your organization. I mean, the ICRC is going there. So good. But okay, what about you saying stop? Or what about you holding the person doing the genocidal acts or violence, or however you want to define it? How about you holding them to account too? The rest of the system has to kick in, and just relying on neutrality is not enough, right? Okay, in the back. Sorry, the gentleman in the back, and then I'll get to you. Yes. I think this ties really well into also what we wanted to get at the end, which was sort of policy recommendations or actionable recommendations moving forward, in a sense of how do we fix this, basically? How do we move forward given all the realities? And the question, again, as a summary about, is it focusing on value-based systems and the sharing of these values a really fundamental part of moving forward and what that means? And so I'll pass on the mic to you, John.
So thank you very much. I want to link it to the previous question. We're in a law school, and I'm a professor in this law school, and this law school itself, and there's at least one other professor here who specializes in this field here, Professor Manakazawa. But we like to project ourselves as at the character of social justice law school. And, one of the big questions in any law school, kind of first year, first class almost, is what's the relationship between law and justice? And so an interesting thing is we talked about humanity and we talked about other subsidiary principles. We didn't actually talk about justice. And I would suggest to you, law in the absence of justice is at least problematical, if not at least not good law. Good law must have a justice character to it. So I mention that because I think what we're experiencing in the world right now, and I have a professorship in international conflict resolution. I work on I'm actively part of an advisory group on a peace process in Ukraine, Russia. There is no process yet, but elements of it. One in northeast Syria, a little bit in Sudan, and a couple other places I'm involved. But I've worked in many such situations, and absolutely essential to them is to any success is a projection of a forward projection, hope, something constructive, and confidence. And what we're living in right now broadly, and it's palpable at the UN, is a crisis of confidence, an absence of confidence, and it's even of self-confidence. They don't believe themselves in their own instruments, their own norms, and so partly because they're seeing them spectacularly, and unfortunately, a significant number of people who are pushing it in a shameless fashion. With purposeful kind of undermining. So my own suggestion to you, first of all, I agree entirely with what the suggestions. And, I think this is just a fact. We live in complex interdependent worlds now. We have for a long time, but we live in a super complex interdependent one. If you didn't realize it before a pandemic or before currency exchange, whatever you want to say, values, I believe these global values really do exist. I've worked in about 80 different countries, 50 different armed conflicts, and people love their children, want to have a better life. They're very simple things in the world, which are very powerful unifying elements. And to get them to work together, to row together, requires hope, not fear. And right now we have a crisis of confidence, which is spinning on fear and fear mongers. And, Trump is the epitomizer of it, and so forth. So I would just say, and by the way, our government on most of this is AWOL. I don't know where the hell they are, on what topic. I don't understand them, and and they babble on about things, and we are irrelevant. I can tell you that internationally, no one even thinks about us, even in places like Ukraine. So what I would suggest is two things. We missed a massive opportunity at the end of the Cold War, when there was almost a unifying element in the world, a readiness to move forward, and we blew it in about 5 years. I can draw a very specific 1999 period when things went very badly, but there was a 5-year window where we could have, and we blew it. And similarly for the UN system, because if you think about the end of almost every major global period of wars, there was some kind of major peace process. In Europe, there was a Charter of Paris for a New Europe, but only in Europe. There was this missed opportunity on a global level to realign, reimagine North, South, and so forth. I don't know if that's possible in the current moment, but what I would say is we must have, and I'll stop with this, the risks we are now facing. I thought as a kid, kind of the nuclear war, I know the nuclear weapons are there, I'm all in favor of disarmament and so forth, but we kind of hid from the risk. But it's now a regularly raised, very real risk. I actually expect nuclear weapon use now. I'm not sure when and where, but it's coming. And when it comes, I don't know how you stop it. So I would say that the catastrophic risk potential now creates an absolute imperative of a leap to a different paradigm. And that paradigm must be only a law of peace. We must get rid of this law of war. Not to stop the effectiveness of the but I mean the paradigm.
I'm going to go back to the law of war, though, to bring my answer. It's just a compliment on that. I think, indeed, it has to go beyond IHL. If we want to talk about peace, we can't stay inside the Geneva Conventions, because the conventions talk about how to deal with conflict. But I can mention an event that I think gives me hope, is that every 4 years, so that's going really soon, we have the International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, which comprises all the actors of the movement, which I mentioned earlier, but also the signatories to the Geneva Conventions. Like that. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, no worries. So the signatories to the Geneva Conventions, which means representatives from every state, they are being there. And the international conference and the statutory meeting, so a lot of meetings with representatives of states and components of the movement, will sit and discuss the next humanitarian issues, the next issues regarding the law of war, the Geneva Conventions. So that it's every 4 years, and they have to get out of the room with a consensus, which means that people will talk. There will be dialogue. And that gives me hope for the more short term, let's say, of this vision. So people will talk and discuss and get to points where they will agree and they will have conversations. So I think that conversation is also going on. And let's see what comes out of it. But usually there are consensus.
And as a person who teaches the younger generation and people from all over the world, I have to say there is a significant rise in the questioning of the current system that we have, and a significant rise in seeing it completely illegitimately, because it's seen as in being applied differently in different places and as a tool to punish some and let loose of others. So there is a crisis. I think it's beyond, yes, the UN and so forth, but I think it's also globally. And it's something that's impacting the next generations to come. Okay. Yes, in the back. So just to summarize again, it's an issue of technology and IHL, with all the benefits of technology, but also some of the downsides. And if I could add to that as well, the use of AI or drones or whatever it is to gather this information, and its contradiction with the aspect of humanity and the humans, and the trust that these people have in, these organizations.
They create new knowledge.
Yeah, no, I know. But if we could also kind of come back to that humanity part of the equation. But I do have to say we're running way over time. So maybe quickly, and then we can get to the final question here, and then we'll close. Would you like to let us know what the final question is? Your question, yeah? And so basically the concept, the definition, like how do you understand neutrality, is also neutrality, if I can just kind of paraphrase and tell me if I'm way off, is neutrality sort of giving the facts, like being truthful to the facts, and then maybe one is worse than the other, but at least you're giving the facts.
Or there's a concept of being neutral.
The idea of
I mean, you can't say anything. And sorry, it's not a question, but I just want to note that Ideas had some really wonderful presentations, and one was on the right to security, and the three speakers who were quoted, Lani speak exactly about that, to the deep discouragement. And I think she spoke about it as a crisis, an existential crisis for her, in terms of how the system works and whether people can really count on these human rights. I just want to mention it.
Thank you. John, you'll start.
Sure. So on technology, I'll just quickly say that so this is another challenge. I talked about technology in terms of kind of elements of precision or destructive capacity or whatever. I didn't mention another element that we're now facing, because historically the idea is that technology was an instrument in the control of human beings. It was a tool. Now we're facing technological developments that explode that paradigm, that we are not in control we may not be. So we have autonomous armed drones, for example, increasingly these kind of the projection that that wars will be fought without human control, essentially. And we're constructing it on some, I would say, perverse notion of our security. I think it's insecurity. So how do we apply law to that? I don't actually know the answer to that. We have some colleagues here in the law school, yourself, but also professors who are broadly looking at this question in the Law and Technology Center. But what I would say is, I'm just going to quote or reference some of the leading AI and other scientists in the world who are now saying we better slow down and stop because we have no idea where this is going, and therefore the catastrophic risk comes again. I mean, just to underline what catastrophic risk is, you know, if there's a 0.01 chance of this place exploding because a nuclear war bomb is going to drop on us, but the risk is 100% that we annihilate, then what's your risk? Is it 0.01 or is it 100%? Your risk is 100%. It's a total loss risk. So this is a misunderstanding about risk analysis. Yeah, of course you want to keep the chance, but you want to avoid catastrophic risk per se. So I think this is a huge issue. The paradigmatic challenge that this presents, that challenges even kind of our values around life. So one of the things that's happened in the humanitarian sphere, and not just international humanitarian law, but aid and humanitarian assistance groups and so forth. Some years ago, I can't remember how many years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, they got together and they elaborated a new kind of system, which they call the humanitarian imperatives. And so they say, okay, if there are disasters, man-made or not, and we're involved, could be war or whatever, what are we trying to do? And they said, you know, we actually have a hierarchy in this. And they said, life-saving is number one. So the value is life is number one. So the first thing we do is we save life. Second of all, we try to maintain life. So maintaining life is the next set of things. And thirdly, we try to sustain life. And so there's a key morality here, which is not just about humanitarianism. This is a really more profound existential idea. This brings together the development and other agencies together with the ICRC and others in this what are called humanitarian imperatives. I think we have to answer your question, we need a profound discussion on this. But I will just tell you one super quick anecdote. When I was a student, like 45 years ago, I'm getting old, I met with one of the people who worked with von Braun on the bomb. He was actually the head of artificial intelligence at MIT. His name escapes me at the time, a German scientist. And he said, you know, the greatest risk of nuclear war at that time, 45 years ago, was error. Because there had been, even then, thousands of scientists working on different programs, and they did not all know everything everyone did. And they had no real idea what was the consequence. We are way, way, way past that with our machines. So, okay, the answer to your question. So first of all, there's a conflation that is very frequent between neutrality and impartiality. So often the word neutrality is used, and it's used in my field around mediation, and more, I've been very active for decades now trying to say, stop talking about neutrality, you mean impartiality. You mean that in order to be effective in an intermediary function, you don't share the positions of any party, and you are seen not to affiliate or share. You're impartial to them. That's an important thing, and for ICRC to function, it must be impartial in that sense. It's not allied to the protagonists and so forth. Are you neutral in the sense of you don't have consideration given to the means or instruments of war, or you don't have consideration given to the outcome at all, if it's genocide, you know, and so forth? I think that's folly, and you could be neutral. But that, I will tell you, is not consistent with other applicable international law. You're not allowed to be neutral. So ICRC and the Red Cross and Red Crescent have not fully grasped or grappled with this problem, in my view. They need to tackle this a lot more head on and understand that the character of conflicts and complex society and all the rest, you can't just toss this word out there anymore and pretend you're somehow, you're not dealing with it. If you mean impartial, you should talk about impartial. But by the way, even in terms of impartiality, if there is a genocidal actor and there is a victim, you're actually supposed to be partial as a matter of law to the victim. You're supposed to be protecting them, not neutral in that sense, or even impartial. So and by the way, Leilani Farr is an old friend and associate. Her crisis of confidence must be very troubling to all of us, because she is not only highly knowledgeable, but has dedicated a career involved. When people like that, and we hadn't, I won't go on more, but when people like that are telling you they're at wit's end, I think the Secretary General of the United Nations is at that point right now. He's at wit's end right now. Then that demands a more radical response.
I'm going to answer to our vision of those answers from the Red Cross movement perspective. I'm going to be quick on that. Regarding AI, I don't have the clear answer. It's still being discussed, but an example of what we are trying to do is the emblem. How do we make sure that the data is protected by the Red Cross movement? So it's still a lot. I'm a lawyer. I'm not good with computers. So it's always that dialogue that we need to make sure that we have engineers also discussing that, because I won't be of any help. But how can we make a digital emblem that is clear on data, that is making sure that it's identified as being data that we have and that it can't be cloned? I don't even know if those are the real words, but that can be used, or it can be used as perfidy or all. So it's still being discussed. It's internal discussion. It's really technical. I don't know where it is exactly, but it has been seen and identified as an issue. And also AI in general, the Secretary General of the UN just made a call to all states, NGOs, and the ICRC responded to what their vision was of the use of intelligence, artificial intelligence. So there is dialogue, but we don't have a clear response yet, because it's so complicated. So that's for AI. And for the neutrality, maybe I can explain our vision of those principles, because impartiality is also one of the fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And we see it as we are providing assistance, and the way we are providing it is impartial, stating that the only hierarchy that we will apply is the need for help. The person or community that needs the most help will be prioritized. That's it. So that's our vision of impartiality. And when we say we are neutral, a lot of people can see it as we are being silent on issues. We don't pick side because we want to protect our staff and we want to be granted access to every zone. So that's the standpoint behind that. We want to make sure that we can go and that we're not impeded access because we are against that party to the conflict. So by being neutral, we are having confidential dialogue. We are, if we have concerns, we will say them, we will tell them, but they won't necessarily be public. It's really rare that you see the movement go public on that, because that's our way to interpret the neutrality. We'll never stay neutral in the face of violence, but we will have those discussions in private, because we judge that it's better that way, so we can remain there and we are not impeded access, because we think that the humanitarian consequences would be greater in that way. That's the movement standing. It won't be the same for any other organizations, and that's okay. But voluntary service is also one of our fundamental principles. We voluntarily submit to those principles because we think that it's the best way that we can comply with our mission. So that would be a summary of how we see neutrality.
Thank you to the both of you. We don't have time for further questions, sorry, but we can hang around a bit if you want to ask us or ask the panelists specific questions. But just one last question. Is there anything you'd like to add that we haven't said? Final remarks.
I would like to thank again the Group of 78 and Canadian Red Cross, on the ground, not to say battlefield, when you encounter persons who are in need of help. I always think about, the core notion of the infinitive of responsibility, which is to respond. And it's kind of the basic moral question, do you respond and how do you respond? And so I would hope, and this is a human value question, that you would respond in a way that helps those who need help. And I think that's what's underlying the Red Cross and Red Crescent and family and movement and so forth, which of course makes the world a better place and in the light of all the challenges that exist. But I would also plead that we cannot be content with that. We must actually ask, what are the causes? What is giving rise to this? And it seems, even if Steven Pinker and friends are right that the numbers and the arc of history is actually still doing pretty well, we're living in a clearly highly insecure world, where a lot of people are not feeling free, are on the edge of not surviving, are suffering. And I think, and that's my plea, is that we continue these dialogues and question, and specifically our governments. We are privileged here in Canada with one of the few largely democratic societies that we can actually challenge, speak out about these things, query, and we really must do so. And I hope you will. And I hope you will continue in our, I love, the G70, the Group of 78's upcoming annual conference, but also other events here. I welcome you to follow us online and to come and attend and participate.
Thank you. Concluded. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really grateful to have shared this moment. Thanks for the questions. Yeah, when I always talk about the movement as us, ourselves, I want to recognize the privilege that I have, that I'm part of the movement, but I'm here. I'm in Ottawa, speaking of the Geneva Conventions. When I talk about my colleagues and I talk about us as a movement, there are people facing the adversity on the ground there. So when I think it's important to recognize that even if we are all a movement, are together, I'm having a thought for those volunteers who are, we hear a lot about the threat that they are going under right now. I think it's important to recognize that. And I touched on a little earlier, and John has said it too, as a population, as Canadians, we have an impact that we can play on. We are the ones that can be loud about how we want IHL to be interpreted, respected, and what the commitments our government can be. So we have a role to play. Can't change the world like that, but I think it's still important to get going, to keep that in mind. So thank you for that.
So I would say, it's true. We are in a very, very depressing time. Social media has not made it easier, access to all this information, but it's helped as well to increase our knowledge and our understanding. And it's hard to keep pushing when we are so burnt out from all the images, everything that we see. But I would also implore people to always continue considering humanity and the humans. There's been so much dehumanization online, in person, in the news. Don't forget that every person is a human being and is connected to their community, their society, their families, their people. Think about the humanity. Yes, there are political issues. Yes, there are groups that are more aggressive than other groups. We can do that, but still be human and still consider humanity. And so we should never put that second, in my opinion. And we should always consider the suffering and understand why there is suffering, and don't let anybody off the hook. That halo effect that we have should be completely removed, and we should be much more aware of the totality of what's happening. So with that, thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate your presence here and the wonderful questions. And I really extend my deepest thanks to John and Fanny for this wonderful conversation. And like I said, we'll be hanging around here if you have any questions or if you want to speak to any of the panelists. And I hope you have a good rest of the day.